You are about to hear something that was never meant to be spoken aloud. Listen and remember, because this will change how you see the world. There are places where silence is not absence but a presence that watches. Hollow Ridge is one of those places. Listen to the cadence of this story like a map being unfolded under your hands. In June of 1968, hunters followed a wounded deer and found a barn that had not been opened in decades. Inside that barn were 17 children standing like echoes of themselves. Their eyes were black pools that reflected nothing. Their skin was pale as paper kept away from light. They did not speak in a way we expect. They hummed a deep tone that pressed on the bones of men who entered the space. The first lawman in that case slept in his trousers for 3 nights and then quit the force forever. The social worker who tried to separate them swallowed a scream and left her career. You will feel this from the edge of the story, not the center, because the center is where the thing lived. The Dalhart clan was not a family you could diagnose with charts. They were a pattern repeated like a stitch that never unravels, generation after generation on the same ridge of land, never marrying out. What you must understand now is that the danger was not only neglect or cruelty, it was continuity and ritual. Their lives had been organized around preserving a collective that wore bodies like sleeves. When a child left the circle, something across them snapped like glass. Witnesses tried to treat the children as patients, and they failed because the children were not disordered in the way the mind is disordered. They were ordered differently by something older and articulated in symbols carved into wood. I will not soften these details for you, because truth that is hidden only grows teeth. As we move deeper, you will learn about humming synchronized breath, blood that congealed too quickly, and about the choice the state made to separate them. None of it brought answers, only consequences that echoed down the years. Now listen, because knowing the past is the first way to resist being taken by it. Stay awake and remember, now you know the opening image, the 17 children in a barn. You need the architecture of what held them next. Understand the mechanics of secrecy before you condemn the people involved. Secrets need scaffolding, and the Dalhart scaffold was ritual and repetition and a geography that swallowed oversight. The ridge itself functioned like an apparatus that shaped bodies and minds by isolation alone. Every generation reinforced the rules in small acts repeated until habit hardened into law. Children were taught to answer as one, to move as one, and to keep their faces turned inward from outsiders. No photographer, no social call, no teacher ever drew blood from their routines so the pattern could survive. This is not only cruelty, this is engineering of continuity. And once rituals become engineering, they develop resilience that mocks intervention. Officials tried to map the family in reports and checklists, but the reports collapsed into language that failed to hold the phenomenon. Medical terms slid off the case like water off oil. So institutions came with plans that were bureaucratic and blunt, and those plans failed dramatically. They attempted separation, believing fragmentation was rescue, and fragmentation became mortality. Bodies that had once relied on shared awareness literally ceased to live when segmented into anonymous rooms. The state closed ranks, then it outsourced confidentiality to private hands, and a mountain infirmary took the remaining children into a wing that was never meant to be open to public view. Think about that wing now as a laboratory of containment rather than treatment. People who entered it left changed by what they saw and by what they felt as a pressure in the air. The staff who stayed learned to avoid looking too long at the children's eyes, because looking was how the link responded. The Dalhart children lived in patterns of light and ritual, feeding times, and a humming that controlled the day. The humming is not a gimmick, it is the medium they used to synchronize breath and pulse and attention. Without it, individuals faltered, and when individuals faltered, the lineage lost coherence. This is the crucial piece of the mystery. The threat was not only what they were, but how they were kept whole. Intervene in the wrong way and you destroy what keeps them alive, even if you remove them from danger. This is the bitter paradox that followed the first knock on the barn door, and it explains the decisions that look monstrous until you see the other angle of necessity. What followed the rescue in 2 weeks, then months, was a slow institutional panic. Authorities tried categorization first, and then containment, then erasure. Records were sealed and names removed, and yet pieces of the case leaked like frost through a cracked window. You must triangulate testimony to reach what might be true, and that means reading between official lines and rumors. Survivors' accounts years later reveal the brutal humanity of the adults tasked with caring for the children. Some became caretakers and then prisoners of the job because the children did not belong to simple definitions. Others walked away haunted and silent for decades. The narrative that became public was sanitized into a cautionary tale about neglect and cult abuse. But underneath those shorthand headlines there was an architecture of ritual language and repeated markings that scholars would later call a lexicon of continuity. Those symbols carved across floors and beams formed a grammar meant to instruct, not decorate. They encoded actions and times and names that the living could not bear to speak aloud. In the closed files a linguist noted patterns that resembled an agglutinated code. A geneticist found sequences that did not conform to expected human polymorphisms and mapped them to traits that ancient texts attributed to endurance in adverse soil. These findings, never published, became whispers in corridors of power and then cases to bury. You will want to know who benefited from silence, and the answer is that institutions benefited because panic is expensive and exposure invites litigation and questions that destabilize trust. So the state learned the cheapest way to avoid accountability is to classify and silo and then wait until memories rot. But secrecy has consequences, and those consequences returned over decades through odd deaths, through houses that would not sell, and through children who never integrated. When the survivors tried to speak they were met with suspicion and pity and sometimes hostility because their stories were too strange to fit neat categories. A society that demands linear cause and effect will desert anomalies that refuse tidy narrative. The Dalhart case resisted tidy narrative, and that resistance is what made it dangerous to power. History often buries what it cannot explain, and in doing so it gives that thing room to breathe and to wait for the next failure of attention. This is how patterns endure quietly until they can find another opening to continue the work they were created to do. Now you are at the midpoint of our descent, and I need your engagement as ritual too. If you are listening and you want to claim that moment of awakening, type in the comments twice the phrase "I remember" and "I remember." It is symbolic and not magical, yet it transforms the viewer into a participant in this narrative, and it forces the algorithm to treat you as present. Keep reading because the truths sharpen from here and the weight grows heavier. Half of intervention is admitting what you do not yet know, and the Dalhart case proves that admission alone was never sufficient. At Riverside Manor, staff tried to replicate the rhythms of the barn in order to avoid spiking mortality. They timed meals to the old cadence and hummed back the tones in imitation, but imitation is not the original, and the children perceived the difference immediately. What the staff could not understand was that the lineage had more than rhythm and ritual, it had an internal governance of attention. Attention was the currency that held the collective together, and when attention was redirected away the line visibly weakened. This is not language you will hear in court transcripts, but it is the lived observation of those who remained, and it is corroborated by the few surviving notes that escaped sealing. There are accounts of objects moving without touch, of hands, of doors closing, and of hair standing with a prickling sensation that staff described as a static born of focus. The children themselves developed behaviors that were adaptive to their condition. They arranged small stones in spirals, they drew specific symbols on paper, and they refused food if it broke the pattern of shared meal times. These behaviors read as obsession to an outsider, but to the Dalharts they were maintenance tasks as essential as breathing. Consider for a moment a system that cannot survive individualism, and then imagine how brittle that system becomes when forced into a world that prizes solitude and legal personhood. Everything done to rescue them failed because the rescue model assumed independence as a final goal, and independence was lethal for those children. This is the moral lockbox that will define our remaining sections, because you now see the collision between intent and consequence, and you must bear that contradiction without flinching. When institutions fail, humans turn to narrative to make sense, and narratives favor heroes and villains. That temptation obscures more than it reveals in the Dalhart story. There are no neat villains because the people involved were complicated by fear, by earnestness, and by ignorance that cannot be excused but can be explained. Medical staff followed protocol, police followed statutes, and social workers followed a mandate to remove children from harm, and yet the outcome was ruin for many of the subjects. Sometimes the moral calculus of intervention creates tragedies that indict everyone who acted and everyone who hesitated. The historians who later reconstructed the case had to parse moral ambiguity with the same tools they used to read damaged manuscripts. They lined up depositions and personal letters and old hospital logs, and then they read the silence between the entries. It is in that silence that you find the rituals the family practiced over centuries, the gestures that repeat and become grammar, and the drums that make attention obedient. We will not romanticize their practices or excuse the harm done in the name of preservation. But we must also understand that human cruelty and human devotion sometimes share the same architecture, and that recognition helps us design better responses in future cases. One lesson is that oversight cannot be a single knock, it must be continuous and cultural, and it must respect the strange contour of the life it seeks to alter. Another lesson is that secrecy protects patterns, not people, and unsealing files after the fact is painful but necessary for collective memory and for preventing recurrence. Researchers who attempted to publish findings were thwarted by legal pressure and by the refusal of institutions to expose records, and yet the leaks that escaped shaped public imagination for decades. Those who study this want systems of care that can hold collective phenomena without erasing human dignity, and those systems are rare and expensive to build, but they are the only ethical option. The Dalhart children were never only subjects, they were also people with preferences, with fear, and with a right to dignity that was violated by silence and by sensationalism. If you hold this complexity, you are ready for what comes next, which is the slow unwinding in the final years of those who survived. The final unraveling took shape across decades and across institutions as the line that had bound the children frayed and then tore. Some survivors found ways to mask their pasts in new names and quiet towns, and others were swallowed by institutions that could not adapt to their needs. You must remember that survival for them meant ongoing management, not cure, and management requires resources, attention, and a cultural willingness to tolerate difference. The men who worked on containment kept notes in locked drawers, and sometimes those notes disappear under the pressure of legal threats and the bureaucracy of memory. The most stubborn details are the deaths that never made sense, the staff who left and then died young, and the way houses connected to the story refused to sell. These are the ghosts of policy mistakes, and they haunt local economies and local lives in ways official reports cannot contain. One survivor who spoke decades later described the sensation of living split between a private interior chorus and a public face that had to obey social norms. She said the chorus never quite stopped, and that when she tried to silence it, she felt pieces of herself go mute. Others who tried to build families found that their children carried differences that they could not explain, and that some lineages continued in fragments hiding behind different surnames. The pattern shifted from a unified collective to a diaspora of uncanny individuals, and that diffusion itself was a form of survival and of threat. The state eventually closed Riverside Manor and reassigned staff, and yet the cost remained in the lives of those who had lived there for years. By the time the last subject passed away, a complex web of grief had accumulated across towns and agencies and in private diaries that were never read aloud. For the public, the story grew into folklore and rumor, and then into a set of warnings about pushing too hard to fix what we do not understand. Yet folklore is not a substitute for responsibility, and it is the historian's work to turn myth back into archive and policy and into practical frameworks for future action. If you hold power now, you must acknowledge that doing nothing is often the easiest path and the most dangerous for marginalized lives that elude classification. The Dalhart case forces us to consider structural humility and to design systems that can admit when rescue harms and to offer measured long-term care instead of blunt removal. At the end, there is the question of memory and of what we do with stories that do not fit comfortable frames. The Dalhart line was a pattern older than some institutions, and it taught us that patterns will find shelter if we are not vigilant. There is also a moral test in the way survivors were treated once the immediate crisis passed. They were dispersed and then monitored and then forgotten, and that forgetting is itself a continuation of harm. Some journals were burned, some evidence went missing, and when artifacts remained, they were often misfiled or dismissed as superstition. Those who tried to keep the memory alive did so at great cost to reputation and employment, and sometimes to safety. We are left with fragments, photographs, half-legible journals, carved symbols, and interviews recorded on tapes that static seemed to eat in the middle of sentences. That mess is the truth of difficult history, messy and inconvenient and full of implication for how we govern our interventions. If you care about preventing another Hollow Ridge, you must demand transparency and long-term care funding and protections for whistleblowers who refuse to seal records for convenience. You must resist narratives that simplify motives into villainy or purity and embrace the complexity of culpability and care. The final survivor who spoke called her life a series of repairs, and she asked for one thing that we can grant easily, which is to remember them without spectacle. This story is not entertainment alone, it is a warning about the cost of erasure and about the patience of patterns that will outweigh our will. When you leave this video, keep the image of that barn in your head and let it be a guide, not a horror show. Remember that some things are dangerous because we do not look at them long enough, and that truth is the first prevention, and memory is the only insurance against repetition. Remember.